So welcome everybody to our session today, looking at keeping your job and maintaining your income. Now, as we run through the session, we will have lots of information for you. If your job is currently under threat, there's options you can work through, and there's also plenty of other support measures via the government support stimulus packages. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, including their elders past and present. I'd like to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution that they make to the life of this region. Now, in terms of my role here, I have been running my own consultancy business for the last 7 years and been in HR for just over 20 years now, and offer a variety of different services out there in the community, such as keynote speaking at conferences and seminars, workshops and training sessions, either in-house, bespoke to that particular organisation, or out there in the community, including a lot with the Small Business Development Corporation. I do HR health checks, and that's normally a starting point for a business, just to help people understand where there might be some gaps in terms of looking at compliance, or also looking at potential performance improvements that can be made. I help people out with documentation. That documentation could be things like contracts of employment, it could be forms or policies and other aspects. Looking at people performance in the workplace, from looking at performance frameworks, competency frameworks, and general performance all round. People technology, including HR systems, looking at people strategy, which is another starting point often with employers, where we look at what the strategy is, and then we can look at what actions we can take to meet those goals. And wellness at work, because I love to introduce some different themes into different sessions that are based on my work as a yoga teacher. Okay, so for our session today, we will be covering a number of different areas, including some warning signs that your job might be under threat. You may also already be seeing some of those sorts of signs in your workplace, or it might be something to look out for in future. We'll have a look at your rights at work, and also some options that you might have available to you at the moment that you can consider, some sources of help, and then at the end we do have a Q&A session. So the sorts of things to look out for in your workplace right now that could warn of difficulties ahead, and maybe they've already impacted, could be things around government announcements. So there may be hints that your industry may be impacted by any further restrictions. Luckily, these last couple of days, the government messaging has been much more positive, in that people have been following the physical distancing, and the actual numbers of COVID-19 cases are dropping quite significantly. So hopefully we don't see any more requirements to shut down, but it may be around certain regions that shutdowns occur due to geographical outbreaks. So for example, in Western Australia, there's a recent outbreak in the Kimberley that meant that lockdown was enacted amongst the different shires, as well as across that particular region. Other warning signs might be that other similar businesses are closing their doors. That could offer an opportunity for your business. For example, it's a cafe that's finding it difficult to trade on takeaway only, then it might be a little bit less competition. So sometimes there are some unfortunate silver linings, I guess, around that. But if you see other parts of your industry struggling, then that's something to bear in mind. You may be in a role where you're seeing customer orders coming through, or perhaps the customer flow, if it's physical premises, might be reduced. That's another warning sign. And you might see that cutbacks have already started. There might be certain things that were given in the past, certain generosities, perhaps there were lots of Easter eggs for everybody at Easter time, or other treats around the place, Friday night drinks and all the rest, that have all been cut back. Of course, Friday night drinks is much more difficult now, we've got to do things virtually. But you may have seen cutbacks to spending, or had that mandated by managers, and so that's a clear warning signal there. Now, you do have rights in the workplace that are unaffected by COVID-19. So the first one of which is that you do have the right to have a safe place of work. Your employer must provide that to you. And so that could include elements where if you're likely to be put at a high risk of COVID-19, that there are steps taken. So it could be that you're in a public facing role, but it could be that an adjustment is made for your role so you can actually undertake that remotely if perhaps you are somebody who's got an issue with your immunity, for example. You also have rights under the National Employment Standards, and these are all laid out in the Fair Work Information Statement that you should have received from your employer when you commence work. If you haven't received one, then you can always look this up in the Fair Work website. If you just pop it in a search engine, the Fair Work Information Statement, it'll pop straight up there. And the Fair Work Information Statement actually covers quite a number of areas. So it covers what the national minimum wage is right now, so you can always check back on what the minimums are across all workplaces. You can have a look at other rights and entitlements you have, such as right to annual leave, right to personal leave, although there is a court case actually happening around that at the moment in terms of looking at part-timers and interpretation of what 10 days personal leave looks like per year for part-timers. That's been a little bit put on hold at the moment while things calm down under the current situation. It covers things like your right to having carers leave, compassionate leave, there's a right to family and domestic violence leave, and a number of other leave types. And that document is updated on a regular basis. So it's updated if there is a change to legislation that could increase people's rights under the National Employment Standards. And it's also changed by the 1st of July each year when the national minimum wage normally increases. And we'll see what happens around the national minimum wage increase. It was cited to be coming through as of the 1st, but then there's a lot of different pressures happening at the moment. So there are a lot of industry groups that are saying under these current difficult trading conditions, there shouldn't be any increase to the national minimum wage, which of course then provides an increase across the 122 modern awards that cover most workers across the nation. But then you've got the flip side of that with Sally McManus from the ACTU, the union side of things, who's saying, well, the best way of us having a good economic recovery following coronavirus is for more cash to be in the pockets of people across the nation, particularly those on a minimum wage. So it'll be interesting to see how generous the government and Fair Work are feeling when we get close to that point in time. But it's likely that they'll be waiting for the latest information to become available on that. So we're unlikely to hear until probably late in June as to what that increase might be. And of course, the national minimum wage is one place for your point of minimum income, but there might be an underpinning award for your place of work that is slightly different, that might allow for higher rates depending on what level you are. And that's often corresponds to your experience, your skills and qualifications. Now, there's some other rights that are coming through as a result of COVID-19. So many awards didn't actually allow you to take approved leave if you had to go in isolation. So I had one employer ring me up to say, okay, we've had this person, they've come back from China, they've got to be in isolation for 2 weeks, but what do we do? Do we pay them? Do we not pay them? It was a bit of a loophole there. And basically that person didn't have a right to take any leave, yet they couldn't return to work because it was mandated that they shouldn't be there because of a potential risk. So now there is a right to pandemic leave under the Fair Work Act. That has all been passed and included now, and that, along with the other notes on this slide, will be in place now until the end of June, and then of course there'll be a review and see if that needs to be extended from there. There's also a right for all workers to be paid the JobKeeper allowance in full if eligible, and there's two different eligibility elements there. So the first one is your employer eligible? And so with that, if you are a not-for-profit organisation, you've had a downturn in your turnover of more than 15% versus the same period last year, or if you're a commercial sector employer under the threshold, then the downturn in turnover needs to be 30% or more. So first of all, it's good to have a chat with your employer to see if they are actually eligible to receive the JobKeeper allowance subsidy. And then if they are, then the employee themselves needs to be eligible to have that subsidy. So that means that you'd need to be a full-time employee, a part-time employee, or a casual who is a regular casual with more than 12 months service. So provided you could tick both of those eligibility boxes, then you would be potentially receiving that JobKeeper allowance. If your employer has not yet registered to be part of the JobKeeper scheme, please encourage them to do so. They've got nothing to lose, and it may be a great way of actually saving jobs. Now, at this time, your managers may be under real pressure trying to figure out how to keep the business running. Information seems to change every day. The legislation is changing every day. There's so many different stimulus packages. There seems to be a lot of confusion out there. So if you can go to your manager and you can go to your employer with information that can help them at this time, I'm sure it would be gladly received. So hopefully your employers can be eligible for the JobKeeper allowance, or hopefully they are actually trading well at the moment and don't actually need to be eligible for that. But should you be eligible for that as a person under your employer, then you have the right to have that full $1,500 per fortnight coming through to you at a minimum. So if you're a part-timer, let's say you're only working 2 days a week and you're only receiving $1,200 per fortnight, you're about to have a pay rise. So you'd get that full $1,500. If you are a full-timer and you're currently working full-time hours, then this JobKeeper allowance will be paid to your employer, and then that will be mixed up in your normal regular wages from there. And it may be then that it can mean that you can continue full-time within an organisation rather than having to consider other options down the line, potentially even redundancy, which of course is a worst case scenario. Another right under the Fair Work Act that has just come in is the right to take leave at full pay, at half pay. So you may be in a position where your employer is encouraging people to take leave and you're happy to take leave, but you'd actually like to take more leave at a lower rate. So there is the ability to apply for that half pay leave. Now, poor payroll people are going to be really under the pump at the moment as well. So dealing with how to transact JobKeeper payments through the system is quite a challenge sometimes. And another challenge is actually working through offering people that leave at half pay. So it might be, for example, if you're a full-time worker, then you would say, okay, well, I want 2 weeks off, and week 1 would be unpaid and week 2 would be full paid, and then over the balance of that fortnight you're effectively having leave at half pay. So if you've applied for leave at half pay, it might look a little bit different on your pay slip, just to make it all happen without any unreasonable delays to you. You also have the right to be paid at least the minimum award rates or the minimum wage if award doesn't apply to you. And so it's worth being familiar with that, and also encouraging your employer, if they are trying to say, oh, okay, well, the government's only given me $1,500, you still got to work full time, I'm only going to pay you the $1,500, that might be an infringement on the modern award. But if there are potential disputes like this, please look to approach them in a constructive manner, in a helpful manner, to avoid further stress. It's likely to get to a quicker outcome if you can have an amenable process if you can. But there are employers confused right now, and I've had several employees that have contacted me recently, including through the 6PR show I recently did with Ollie Peterson, where there are employers that are actually making unilateral changes and not passing things on as they should. So start off with a friendly conversation, but also understand your rights underpinning that. And it's good to have a good look through the Fair Work website to familiarise yourself with your rights. I wouldn't advise trying to call them right now because it takes quite a long time to get through. Before COVID-19, you'd be waiting probably half an hour to get through to deal with a query, and now it's blown out quite significantly. So best to try and look on the website where you can. Now, within a workplace that's undergoing change, there is also a requirement for consultation to occur. So if, for example, there was a situation of redundancies, an employer can't just go and send out a text message or an email to go, that's it, you've all been retrenched and it'll all be sorted out in your next pay packet. That doesn't comply with the Fair Work Act. And when I'm talking about the Fair Work Act, that's because it covers the vast majority of cases. Just in case you're tuning in and you do come from an employer that isn't a national systems employer, then you'd have to have a look at the relevant state-based legislation for that. And an example of a state-based legislation applicability would be, for example, local government. Although there have been some cases where local government have actually been through the court process in the federal system under the Fair Work Act, so it is a bit of a murky area. But for the most part, people will be covered by the Fair Work Act, and there is that need to have a proper consultation. And a proper consultation isn't you tell somebody at 9 o'clock that there's a risk of redundancy, you have a bit of a chat, and then at 9:30 you let them know that there's their role is being made redundant. It has to be a genuine collaborative process. And so within a consultation process, if you do find yourself in that situation, that's where it's good to be prepared. Forearmed is a great place to be in this. So if you can understand, okay, what is the outcome this employer is seeking? What payroll savings are they needing to make across their organisation right now to make this a viable business? And then when you understand those sorts of elements, that's where you can understand, okay, well, let's have a look at a different option. Can we have a look at other elements? So options for your boss could be, okay, let's first of all talk about a recruitment freeze. It's silly to be making redundancies here if you're hiring people over there, unless the roles are completely different. So another right you've got is in a redundancy situation is the ability to be transferred to a different role. An employer must consider redeployment. So if you are working in reception for a business and your role is going to be made redundant because there's no longer people coming to the front door, but yet they are having a lot of customer service queries, then perhaps that role could be redeployed to a customer service role. And with a little bit of training, you've retained that person's employment, but also you haven't lost all of that training and all of that knowledge that that person possesses within an organisation. So really have a chat with your manager to see if there might be opportunities to look at that. And so you can help them to do the right thing in this situation. Another thing that you might want to look at is a pay freeze, which in these difficult times might not be something that's particularly welcome, but if it's a pay freeze versus no job, then there's a potential saving for an organisation. And as I mentioned, it may be that your organisation doesn't have to implement an uplift in wages when the National Minimum Wage Review is complete. There is also the option to have a look at variations. So if you are in a workplace that has got an enterprise agreement in place, then there is a possibility to put in a variation. And so by being here on this session today and familiarising yourself with these rights, this might be a great way of chatting to others in your workplace. So if you know that the business is in trouble, the warning signs we mentioned are there, then you could even go proactively to your employer to go, can we afford this pay increase? If you're looking at redundancies, maybe we can actually get together and talk about a variation to put a pay freeze in place for the foreseeable future instead. That might be a great way of actually getting in there on the front foot and saving some jobs, your own and also your peers. Now, your boss might actually look at another option, which could be to reduce contracted hours. And so then normally there is a pro rata adjustment to your salary. So for example, if you're going to have a 20% cut to your hours, then that would be a 20% cut to your overall salary in your general pay packet. Now, with the way that the tax structure works, the higher earners are often they're taxed at a higher level, and so sometimes, although it might look like 20% that's coming off the gross, your actual net isn't impacted quite as much, depending on how you get paid and where you fall in those tax bands. So it's worth actually having a chat with people. So if you have had a heart-to-heart with your manager and they've said, look, things are really in trouble, I don't know what to do, and have a chat about the savings, and you could be an advocate for your staff then to sort of go share with your peers, look, the organisation's in trouble, let's have a bit of a think about what we might be able to do to help. So there is that as an option. You could also have a chat with your boss about going, well, okay, we've been paid pretty well up to date. Maybe we can temporarily reduce our salaries and agree to an arrangement there. And with that's okay, as long as the salaries or wages aren't getting reduced below those legal minimums. So below what is in your award, or below what is in the national minimum wage. Now, with these sorts of arrangements where there are temporary reductions to salary and or wage, the working hours, it's good to make sure that's in writing. In the workplace, you can make a contract just verbally. It's something that's sort of hung around from the dark ages of law generally, but it's really not a good place to be because it doesn't really give that level of clarity. People can't look back on it. If you can get something in writing in place with your employer, it puts everybody into a position where they know where they stand. And so then you can go, okay, well, now we know exactly what period this adjustment is for. So be that period for 3 months or 6 months or however long that is in place. There's also the option to look at inviting people to take leave. So within an organisation, if you're up with your financial skills, then you've got your assets and your liabilities. So your assets are the things that are positive for the organisation. So if they own big things like buildings and equipment and things like that, and also the cash at the bank, they're all assets, they're all positives for a business. And your liabilities are things like your debts. So if there's business loans to pay off equipment or other elements of money owed to others. And your leave, so your things like your annual leave and your long service leave sit there as a liability for the organisation. And if you were to leave, be that a resignation or a redundancy or whatever the situation might be, then your employer has to pay out that leave anyway. So why not, if things are quiet, look at taking leave? And it might be that that's also a good way of topping up income for a short period of time. If your employer has enough cash, if they said, look, you know, we need to cut you down to 3 days a week instead of 5, but you can take some leave on top, then you can top up your income there. There is the potential also to look at some voluntary redundancies. So if you know somebody who is willing to leave because they really don't need to work, perhaps they can already, they've got a good super fund and they're at a point in time in their age in their life where they can take a retirement. They were in work really for the social elements and you know, having a purpose for the day, and they thought, oh well, maybe I can just go and do some volunteer work for food bank or something, do something else in this difficult time. Then hey, look, that could provide some great payroll savings that can then be very, very useful to an employer. So that might be an option there. And if that's the situation that you know people are currently in, then that could be a suggestion to encourage them to go and speak to their manager about that. Another option is to look at shutdown, and this would come before looking at a potential redundancy situation, hopefully for employers. So this actually offers some ongoing hope for people that there will be a job when things pick up, when things do turn around. Now, up until now, under the Fair Work Act, and if you really fancy having something to help you go to sleep at night, have a good old trawl through section 524, which concerns the stand down of staff. So that is where, through circumstances, the employer no longer requires people to perform work. And so as a result of that, they shut down operations. It would usually apply across a whole organisation. So for example, if you've got a pub, then right now they've probably enacted a shutdown and everybody is still employed but not receiving any money, because for a shutdown period, an employer does not need to pay you. So if you are in a situation where you're currently working for an employer and they have gone through a shutdown, then you can, of course, look at accessing through Services Australia, through Centrelink. You can actually look at the job seeker payment there, and hopefully you are eligible. And they have made it easier to apply. So the usual hurdles and maze you had to work yourself through to ever get any money out of Centrelink has got a little easier, in that documentation isn't required for people around that. But it is still good to have some kind of evidence from your employer. So hopefully your employer has sent some kind of written communication, be that an email or a letter, talking about what the stand down is all about, sort of why it's been triggered, and also when it might be lifted, or how you'll find out when it will be lifted. Now, if your employer is eligible for the JobKeeper payment, then they can actually also do all sorts of other things, including stand down individual members of staff. So one of my clients, for example, they have a call centre and then they also have a training arm. So their call centre is still ticking along quite nicely because they can still all work like they did before. They were remote from people, and they've actually been set up to work remotely in their own homes. Whereas the training was the sort of training that had to be delivered in person, and because the nature of it isn't effective to deliver via online portals, because the difficulty of connectivity out in regional and remote areas where they were servicing, and also not many of the people that were attending those sorts of sessions actually had access to a computer. So they're in a situation where it might be that the handful of people in training could be selected to be stood down, whereas the other call centre part of the business could carry on running quite easily. And different departments can be shut down under the normal Fair Work Act, but often they're bigger groups. So for example, Qantas was one of the early employers. When international flights really started to reduce significantly, they actually enacted a shutdown for a lot of their staff at that point in time, even though the whole organisation hadn't been shut itself. Now, the last resort in this is to look at forced redundancies, and hopefully you can persuade your employer to avoid this wherever possible, or minimise this wherever possible. And to help your employer to be able to minimise or avoid any redundancies, then there are some great sources of help out there. So the government being one of them. So the government has a whole range of different stimulus packages available. The JobKeeper allowance is really quite significant, but there are some other elements as well. And it depends on the size of your organisation and what the impact of COVID-19 has actually been. And it isn't just the federal government. You hear a lot of ScoMo up there talking about his next release of money out there to the masses, and Josh Frydenberg doing the same. But there's also a lot happening by the state government. So for example, in Western Australia, the state government has got a lot that they've put in place around payroll tax relief. And payroll tax in WA is sat at about 5.5% at the moment. So if by changing the bandings around the payroll tax threshold, then your employer might no longer have to pay payroll tax, and that could be quite a nice saving that they can get hold of. And look at the Treasury WA website for further information on payroll tax savings. It's got all of the different thresholds in there, and that could be useful information to pass on to your boss or your employer. And more will come through soon. So the government has also got information available on its Treasury website, the federal government that is, and also on business.gov.au. And those two sources talk about all sorts of things like the increase in the instant asset write-off. So normally if you bought an asset, then it would take time for you actually to gain the tax advantages of that expenditure. Whereas that threshold has been increased, so they can actually offset more tax this year, and so that might be able to help with cash flow right now. The ATO is actually your friend at the moment. So the ATO is doing a lot out there. They actually are the people running the JobKeeper scheme, because it's actually being paid as a job subsidy through employers, and they'll understand who is eligible by who is employed on that 1st of March date, and they'll be looking at the information that they get through the single touch payroll system. So when you get paid, information is automatically uploaded to the Australian Taxation Office right now, and they'll be looking at that when they look at the payments. Your bank could also be your friend in this situation, and that's where you can actually go back to them and talk about your current financial situation, and they can have a look at what might work best for you. And I will go into a little bit more detail around that in just a moment. Your insurance company might be another source of help in this current climate. So it could be that you have some kind of income protection in place. Generally it might be that if you've got a private income protection set up, you can be better covered quite often, rather than if you've got something just through your super fund. But have a look just in case anyway. And with that, you can also have a chat with your insurer if you've got insurance payments coming up, be that for your vehicle or your home or whatever it is. If you need to look at deferring payments or reducing payments, or perhaps you normally pay a lump sum and you want to actually go to just paying off direct debit on a regular basis, just have a chat with them and see what you can negotiate there. I did skip over your landlord then. So if you have a rental property that you are residing in rather than having a mortgage, then it's really good to have a chat with your landlord. My business has seen a downturn in this time, and I have engaged in a conversation with my landlord, and this week I managed to secure a reduction in our rent. So very, very happy and relieved about that. And for the most part, landlords out there are understanding of the current situation that everybody is facing. And if there's any difficulties, then hopefully your landlord can actually have a chat with their bank. And there are reliefs available for people who are landlords who have loans on properties, as well as people who have their own home loans for their own home. And the final point up there is your utilities supplier. So if you are in difficulty, have a chat with them. There are commitments in Western Australia from the state government that people's power will not be cut off, that people's water supply will not be cut off. But it's always good to be proactive. So if you do think you've got difficulties, then have a look at what you can do to set up payment plans to just keep on top of those bills so that they don't get out of control. Now, just a quick point on your landlord side of things. If you are getting into a little bit of debt and finding it difficult to pay, there is some different information coming around this, and it's different state by state, because looking at residential tenancies actually comes under state-based legislation. And so if you were to have some kind of a rent holiday that's agreed to, so you don't have to pay a rent for maybe a couple of weeks or a couple of months, the landlord is often able to say, look, okay, I'm open to doing that, but they will probably still require that rent to be paid at some point in time. So if you are in a situation where maybe you've got reduced hours, and then let's say in June they go back up again, rather than celebrating too hard and spending all your cash, you might need to back pay any rental payments there. Now, in terms of looking at your budgeting, there are the big four banks offering services and support. So there are deferrals available. For example, Commonwealth Bank offers deferrals for up to 6 months. But the bank will still be charging interest during that time. So if you can afford to make some payments, it is good to try and keep making some payments just to keep on top of things, so you're not extending out the lifespan of your mortgage too much. NAB are similar, so pausing repayments. And as I mentioned, the big four, like ANZ, they're actually putting things in place, but it isn't just those banks that are doing things. If you're with a smaller bank, if you're with, let's say, Bendigo Bank or another sort of credit union organisation, for example, then they've also got help in place. And it does vary. So if you've got a couple of different arrangements in place, so let's say you've got a loan with one bank and a mortgage somewhere else, then have a chat to all of them about what you might be able to do to make sure things are manageable. Because the last things that that banks are looking to do at the moment is look at foreclosures on loans. You can see on there, Westpac can apply for repayment pauses, so 3 months and then another 3 months. Looking at other elements of help, I mentioned that you might be able to tap into income protection and deferring your premium payments. And if you are deferring premium payments, please make sure that you're aware of any changes that might happen to your coverage in that time, so that you're aware of all the T's and C's there, and look at your payment plans for other utilities. And I am not a financial advisor. You'll see the disclaimer at the bottom there. This information is general. It's not intended to be financial advice. There is some really great information on the moneysmart.gov.au website, and that includes a really handy budget planner that you can look through on there. It's worth plugging in any changes that you've had recently to your income levels, or if you're looking at going, okay, well, I know our boss needs to reduce payroll by this amount, then what impact would that actually have on my household income? Where can I cut back a little bit? Then it's a very cool tool. Income payments. So regardless of your situation, you might want to have a little bit of a look just to see if you are entitled to anything. There's a whole range of payments. There's actually a whole page set up dedicated on many government websites. So Department of Social Security has got information on there around what sort of payments you might be able to tap into. Services Australia, and that's where you can get information on the sorts of Centrelink payments that are available there as well. And with that, that also includes the job seeker payment. So if you've been stood down and your employer is going to be going for JobKeeper, then please just maintain your job seeker payments if that's what you're currently on, because you can declare any changes to your income levels as and when they come in, and then they'll make adjustments to your job seeker payments from there. So just keep things going for now, because there is a chance that by some quirk it might be that your employer is not eligible, or perhaps if you're a casual, maybe you haven't quite been employed long enough. You thought it maybe was already a year, but actually it was last May that you started work, so you haven't met the threshold there. Or perhaps it was the 2nd of March last year that you started, and you do need that 12 months going back from the 1st of March this year if you are a casual. And the Treasury website not just has great information for employers, but also there are some really handy information sheets on there for individuals. And the ones that you can get from the Treasury website are really concise. It's maybe 3 pages long, and it's got a whole host of different elements on there. Now, I have mentioned the JobKeeper a couple of times. So that's your $1,500 per fortnight per eligible employee. And so that'll be applying from March onwards, and it's for a maximum of 6 months. So if you have already been made redundant, you could actually go back to your old employer and say, hey, I was employed as at the 1st of March, and if you're a permanent or a part-timer, or you meet that service period for a casual, and see if you can negotiate with them a way of reversing your redundancy payment and then putting the JobKeeper payment in instead. It's a little bit of extra admin at their end, but then they get the benefit of having you available to work as soon as things pick up again. So as I mentioned, you do have to receive that $1,500 before tax. There's no pro-ratering this if you're a part-time employee. So you can have a look at the eligibility requirements, and those are available on the ATO website if you wanted to check through those, but we've pretty much covered that off here. Talk to your employer, let them know that you want them to claim the JobKeeper payment for you, and also you'll probably have to fill in a form to claim that. Now, if you have multiple jobs, let's say you've got a couple of different casual jobs, maybe you're working in a bar and a shop and something else, then you have to choose an employer to receive this. You can't get, if you're working 3 jobs and you've been stood down from 1 or more of those jobs, then you can't go picking up JobKeeper from all 3. You have to choose that primary employer and let your other employers know that you're actually seeking JobKeeper through that particular employer. Before you nominate which employer you want to receive the JobKeeper from, you might want to have a chat with that particular employer and make sure they're actually eligible. If you run a business, then you might also be entitled to the JobKeeper payment, because it is actually extended out to sole traders and also individuals that are in, let's say, proprietary limited organisations. But the information on that hasn't quite come to light because the legislation only passed a week ago, and it is a little bit vague, let's say. Other steps, there's an employee nomination notice that you'll receive at some point from your employer if they're eligible, so just get that back to them ASAP, and let Services Australia know once you've signed off that form, and then they'll be able to make sure your JobKeeper payments, if that's what you're receiving right now, is all transacted properly, so you don't end up building up any debts with them and end up having to pay back lots of money. So the organisations that are covered, as I mentioned, include self-employed individuals, but also include charities as well for JobKeeper. And another thing that you could potentially look at, which is very much a place of last resort, is cashing in super. There has been a huge amount of interest from people applying to cash in super, but a lot of people don't realise the impact of that long term. So if you take out 100,000 now, a financial person on one of the news shows the other day was saying, if let's say you're a young person, you take it out now, you're in your 20s, that's going to mean you're $100,000 worse off when you hit retirement. So it's worth getting some further information on what the ramifications could be of that particular action if you were considering it right now. Think twice perhaps. Tax time, it's good to have a look at what you might want to do there. If you're in a situation where you're working from a work environment, but now you're actually working remotely from home perhaps, let's say you've got a home office set up, keep any receipts of anything that you have paid for. It could be that you've bought some stationery, some pens, notepads, maybe you bought some post-it notes and other bits and pieces, maybe you bought an office chair, you might have had to buy a desk or a screen, or maybe you're lucky enough to have your employer let you have a screen for your home office. Keep all those receipts and please have a chat with your accountant for information and advice specific to your situation. The tax office have said that you can claim the hourly rates, which is a pretty easy one, where there is a set amount, I think it's about 80 cents an hour for the time that you spend in your home office environment. Or you can claim a proportionate part of your home expenses. And often you're better off doing that, but it is more complicated. So it's for you to have a little bit of a think about what's best for you. So if you've got an accountant you use already, then you've got that information at your fingertips, or maybe you're lucky enough to have a relative or a friend who's an accountant who's happy to help you out, and maybe consider looking at that apportioning a part of your home expenses rather than that hourly rate one, and you can get hold of a little bit more money in your tax refund. Now, it's good to be prepared. You never know what might happen. Maybe you're seeing some of the warning signs and maybe that's why you're here on the webinar today. So it's good to have your resume up to date, making sure you've got all of your latest information in there, making sure it reads well, maybe get somebody else to give you an opinion on it. They might be able to pick up any sneaky spelling or grammar issues. Prepare your references too, so have a think about who would be your referee, have a chat with them and let them know that maybe you're not looking for work right now, but just in case, will they act as a referee for you? Have a think about your network. So now's a good time to get out there on LinkedIn, connect up with people that you've worked with in the past, particularly in areas that might be in a growth phase right now. You might want to set up some job notifications if you really think things are turning bad. But within that, it's good to look at some very prudent budgeting right now, because it's good to plan for a long job search if you are looking, because the jobless rates have gone up. Thankfully, the figures released today are lower than were expected. So it's good to see a lot of employers that are retaining people and hopefully using JobKeeper rather than making redundancies. And also self-care. So if you are in a situation where a redundancy does occur, having a think about, okay, how can I plan for this? Not just financially, but looking after me. How can I be my best self? And how can I present that best self if I have to get out there and do a job search? And maybe take a moment just to reflect about how you get to your best self. Maybe you love going out and having a nice walk in nature, or maybe you like to do a little bit of yoga or meditation like me, or all sorts of different things can be useful. Exercise is a great way of getting yourself in a good mindset. And if you do find that you're not in such a positive mindset, or even maybe loved ones are not, then there are sources of help. So a lot of employers offer an EAP program, but that's often limited to, it might be 3 or 6 sessions. If you exceed that and you need help, or perhaps your workplace doesn't have any help, there's a useful service available through Helping Minds now. So this is free to anybody in West Australia and the Northern Territory. So if you're feeling overwhelmed right now by your personal circumstances, then you can actually access 3 free sessions, either over the phone or video counselling sessions. You don't need any referrals or anything. You just ring their 1-800 number and you can make that appointment. And they're available between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. every day. Other sources of help include Lifeline or Beyond Blue, but if there is an emergency where there is a person at risk of harming themselves, then it is good to dial 000. Even in these difficult times, dial 000, because these people are fully equipped to deal with these situations. There's also financial counselling that's available via the National Debt Helpline, and the Money Smart website that's got that great budget tool on there, and all sorts of other bits and pieces is quite useful too. If you are experiencing any domestic violence, then there's help available through 1-800 RESPECT. And for people using violence, there's Men's Line Australia and Men's Referral Service. And sadly, with this time of a lot of people living in quite isolated home environments, domestic violence is on the rise. So if that is something that's impacted you or anybody you know, please encourage them to seek some help. And if you have kids that are finding things difficult at the time, there's also Kids Helpline. Now, to end on a little bit of a high, another way that you can really help your employer right now is looking at innovation. There's some really interesting stories, and a lady who I was on a webinar with back a couple of weeks ago shared a great story where she was over in France, and one of the bakers over there had seen what was going on and went, wow, all these people are looking for a little bit different. So normally they'd be rushing around, busy, off to work. They just want to buy their loaf of bread and then off they go with their day. Whereas with so many places shut down, and France has got much more drastic shutdown situation than us, then they've got all this time on their hands. So this bakery decided they were going to actually start selling sourdough starter kits. And so people would come in and they'd buy a kit, and then this is something great they could do with their family. They could go and they could bake their own bread, and it was more of an experience and give people something to do, a bit of purpose in their day. And it's not just in France, it's also locally. So there's a little winery based down in Collie, and they're called the Harris River Estate. And they've actually been producing wine for a number of years and decided that they were going to go and diversify into making gin. And they haven't got around to really making any gin because with COVID-19, they've actually decided to start making hand sanitizer. And so this product is now available for people down in the local community. And thankfully replicating much of the theme of kindness that we're seeing out there in the community right now, we're actually giving out free hand sanitizer to people in the local Aboriginal community down there, people who are vulnerable and at risk down there, and then it's also available for sale for other people right now. So they're meeting a great need there, and they even got some great coverage on SBS the other day, which was fantastic to see. So that brings us towards the end of the conversation today, and now is the opportunity for you to ask some questions. So feel free to tap away in the chat tool there, and I will get this up on the screen, ready to start answering your questions. Okay, I can see we've got a comment in the chat box right now. And somebody's going to be tapping into the recording later, which is great. And I'm also going to unmute you all now as well in just a moment, because then if you feel like you'd rather ask a question verbally rather than tapping away in the chat box, then you can do that also. Okay, there we go. So you're all unmuted. So feel free to ask any questions that you have.
Hi, Pauline, if I may.
Yep, go ahead.
If the employee is retained by their employer, but because the business is effectively closed, because it's a dentist that I'm referring to.
Oh, yeah.
And that now they've retained the employee. Do they have to pay super on the payments that they're making to that employee? Because it's effectively not ordinary times earnings now, is it?
No, that's a really good point, Grant. And that is something that you're right. Ordinary time earnings, which would be for your general time worked, would attract super. So if you've got a full-timer who is working for an organisation that's eligible for JobKeeper, and the JobKeeper is topping up their wages, then it would be likely for that person to be able to have super on that entire amount. But if somebody's not working, then technically you're right, not ordinary hours. So it would be unlikely that they would be able to have super on that. And that's an important note to actually think about for employees in that situation is, do people want that gap in their super? Can they afford to still maintain some contributions? And they might decide that they actually want to make a salary sacrifice contribution into super right now if they can afford it.
Thank you.
That's all right. And more information will hopefully be coming soon on the ATO website, just to confirm that. So there is a table on the ATO website that's actually got on there all the different payments for allowances and all sorts of other different bits and pieces. And it actually talks through what attracts super and what doesn't. And at the moment, the JobKeeper payment isn't on that table, but I'm hoping it will appear soon so that it's very clear for employers where super is payable. Okay, any other questions?
Hi, Pauline. It's Agatha here again. Hey, how you doing?
Hi, good. How are you?
Good, good. First of all, thank you. That was very helpful. I think it's a very good webinar. I do have one question, and regarding the JobKeeper and eligibility for Australian permanent residents and different subclass of residency. Now, I guess as an employee, and as an employer, what is the responsibility and the legality side of things to ensure your employee, and as an employee also to come forward, I guess, if the employer are unaware about your residency?
Yes, that's a really good point. So people who are Australian citizens and permanent residents, they are eligible for the JobKeeper payment potentially. But you're right, people who are here on other visas may be ineligible. And it really does depend on the visa type. So it's definitely worth a conversation if somebody is on a different visa other than being a permanent resident, just to see if there is any coverage. And again, that's why it's so important that people apply for the JobKeeper as an employer, because not everyone will be covered. It's good to sort of get the most of any income boosts that are available for a business right now.
Sorry, just a follow up on that. Then does that mean ATO is also aware anyway? So we don't have to, I guess, ensure if we put forward everyone in within the company,
Yeah.
ATO would be aware of who is eligible and who's not.
As a starting point initially, it's good to put everybody forward, but you also need to get that declaration form back from employees that they're willing to receive that payment. And so then at that point in time, that could be where you actually have a check. And the ATO, if you look up the ATO JobKeeper payments, then there is actually a section on there on the eligible employees. So yeah, you can have a look through there, and it'll actually talk about what happens for people who are not permanent residents or Australian citizens.
Thank you very much.
No worries. Okay, any other questions? We've got time to sneak one more in. We've got 1 more minute to go. Okay, so nothing's coming through so far, so that's all good. So we'll wrap things up from there. So I'd just like to thank you very much for attending the session today, and you will have a recording available from this afterwards that we'll send out shortly. And there is one more session that we're holding this afternoon at 3 p.m, which is also available up on Eventbrite, which talks in a little bit more detail about how to look at seeking employment at this time. So thank you, and good luck, and take care in these interesting times we face. Okay, bye-bye.